Good morning, friends, and welcome, viewers. This is UGC CEC Advocate Network, and we are running a series of lectures on Indian writing in English translation. Now the series is coming to an end, and ideally we should finish in February or at the most March. And the last lectures are focused upon the writing in India in the 20th century. And we are taking up certain languages, and today's language from the point of view of poetry is Hindi. And we'll take up today for discussion two major writers. You can call them giants of literary voice in Hindi. They are Suryakant Tripathi Nirala and Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh. Nirala started his career in the early 20th century, and Muktibodh came in the middle of it. And they seem to have some vital link with each other, which will be, of course, explained in the lecture by our resource person, who is Dr. Richa Bajaj. She teaches English literature in Hindu College, University of Delhi, and she has done a special study of modern Indian writing. So we requested her to talk on these two authors. Before I request Dr. Bajaj to give her lecture, viewers, let me inform you again that we keep 10 minutes of this lecture reserved for you. If you have to ask some questions, if you have to give a counter perspective, if you have to make a query, observations, then you are welcome to do so in the last 10 minutes, which start from 10:50. So we'll be waiting for your responses if you have any. And the number, which is toll free, that you can use for this would be 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. Now I welcome Dr. Richa Bajaj. Welcome, Richa, and please give your lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Anand Prakash. Welcome, viewers. Today we'll discuss poetry, and especially Hindi poets, who wrote in the 20th century, the early to the mid 20th century. And in this respect, I will be speaking about Suryakant Tripathi Nirala and Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh. These would be the two writers that I would focus on, but I would also like you to have a kind of an understanding or an overview of poetry as it was written in India, especially in Hindi, in the 20th century. So when we speak about poetry, then the first thing that comes to one's mind is perhaps you'd be thinking lyric, song, or some kind of, something that entertains, that's more lyrical, and that is only meant for pleasure principle. And that is the larger point about poetry that we should try and understand as to whether poetry has any role to play in our lives. I mean, sometimes we say that, fiction in that sense gives us an understanding of our lives better. And in that sense, we see our own lives spread out on the page, and, it's a long piece, the fictional work. So we actually have an idea of our life in fictional works. But when it comes to poetry, often the idea is that it's just a figment of the poet's mind, and poet is merely expressing himself, and there is nothing much for the reader to gain from it than its pleasure value. Now, I would like to differ from this idea, and especially in the context of the 20th century in India, poetry had a very different role to play. Poetry wasn't just limited to the sphere of pleasure or entertainment or simple expression, personal expression. It had a role to play. Now, what kind of role did it play? That is also another question. Did it, help people understand their lives better? And if so, then how? How can poetry do such a thing? Now, that is something that we need to understand, that poetry in the 20th century was struggling to find its feet, or was struggling to find an identity of its own in India, as individuals were. The 20th century, particularly in India, was a very interesting century, because this was the period when people were actually trying to carve out a personality of their own. They had models before them. They could follow these models, whether it was the figure of Mahatma Gandhi or Bhagat Singh, and others. People at that time had somebody to follow. and they could always carve out their personalities based on these national figures, or and so there is this kind of a thing that individuals were trying to create their own personalities, were trying to carve out a self for themselves. And so in this particular respect, poetry was doing exactly the same. Poetry was also trying to carve a self for its own particular self. And what do I mean by that? What I mean to say by this is that poetry, was trying to not do what it has always been doing, which is to, just give pleasure to people and, just have a kind of a lyrical value of its own. It was trying to make a difference to people's life. It was trying to say things about society, about concerns of people, and take into account a different kind of expression. Now, a different kind of expression was facilitated by the movements that were taking place in India. The early 20th century, as you know, was the period of intense national debates and national struggle, and the freedom fight was the movement of the freedom fight was building up. The nationalist movement was attained a kind of a direction under the helm under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, and in literature Rabindranath Tagore was giving that direction. So you see, this kind of direction, space, national struggle, all this that was happening in India was in a way also defining poetry. Rabindranath Tagore, in fact, took it upon himself to write a kind of poetry which would, talk to people, which will talk about the concerns of the people. Even as there was a strain of mysticism in him, he also tried to come to reality often and, talk about people's concerns as well. And when we speak of Nirala, then we have to understand that Nirala was actually born in Bengal and in the Midnapur district, and he was born, in 1899, and when Nirala was growing up, then he had the model of Rabindranath Tagore to look up to. Obviously, he was deeply influenced by the Ramakrishna Mission School as well. But you see, there's the reformative streak and the streak of mysticism that is found in Tagore has also been taken up by Nirala, consciously or not. That's a different thing. But Nirala, in his formative years, gained these kind of experiences. He also, understood what poetry was meant to do. So Tagore was an important influence in that sense, and Nirala tried to imbibe those values. But Nirala, of course, Nirala's family was from Uttar Pradesh, from the Kannauj district, so they had migrated to Bengal, and where he was born, so he knew Bengali and he understood the culture there, he understood the language, and also was privy to the Bengal Renaissance and its values. So he carried all that within him. When he moved even when he went back to Uttar Pradesh, there was a time when his father was upset with him and he actually sent him packing. That's the time when he shifts to Uttar Pradesh with his wife in 1914 or so. And this is the period where, he starts also writing and he comes in touch with Hindi as another medium of expression. So from having a kind of a training in these different languages such as Hindi and Bengali, and also he knew Sanskrit, so there is this kind of a blend of languages that takes place in Nirala. So when in his stint in Uttar Pradesh in around 1914, when his son is also born, later on his daughter is also born in 1917, Suraj, who's born in Uttar Pradesh. So this is the period where he spends time and he learns a different kind of language, Hindi, and with Hindi he also learns a different kind of sensibility. So in Nirala, these different influences work, and he's constantly trying to carve out a personality based on language. Now, when we speak of language and values are very much associated with one another. They are not very different spheres of activities. When you understand the language of a place, then you also understand the culture of that place, also understand and the values that people hold important in that space. So as Nirala enters this sphere of Hindi, then he also sees, he's privy to the Dvivevi poets and the poets who wrote in the early periods of the 20th century, from the late 19th century to till the 1920s. A certain kind of poetry is written in Hindi, which is quite didactic, and also at the same time is set in meters and follows a particular pattern. Now, Nirala finds that his expression does not go well with this kind of poetry, and he doesn't wish to be preachy in his poetry, and he doesn't wish to, talk about what should be done. He, he sets scores by a different kind of poetry where he will underpin the value of free verse and bring free verse to his poetry. He'll use symbols. He'll not take suggestive words. So he emphasizes suggestiveness in poetry. He emphasizes at the same time the liberty to play with styles and verse forms. So he does that in his poems, and he doesn't follow the Dvivevi poets in that sense. Now, the Dvivevi poets were then this period had social concerns at the center, and also thought of writing that kind of literature which will be useful for the masses. Now, that is why it became a kind of it became more restrained, and it could not go to the feelings of the people. It could not talk about the concerns of the people. Nirala found a different way, and Nirala is among the Chayavadi poets who think of choosing an alternate medium to express themselves. So the Chayavadi poets, and we've heard of Jaishankar Prasad, we've heard of Nirala, of course, is there, and there is Sumitranandan Pant, and there is Mahadevi Verma. All these four poets then constitute the Chayavadi poets. They're all dealing with, so Chayavadi in that sense is romantic poetry, and Chayavad, literally would be reflection or shadow. But so romantic poetry, Chayavadi poetry, emphasizes introspection, and also at the same time a kind of romantic view of life. Now, a lot of critics criticized Chayavadi poets for the reason that they thought that it was a kind of escape from their escape from reality. They weren't trying to answer the questions of society. They weren't trying to also encounter the problems. In fact, they found an escape route. And in a lot of places it was true as well, because when we see the poetry of Jaishankar Prasad, we find that he uses the personalized lyric a lot and takes the source. His sources are mostly these mythological sources that he talks about, and his Kamayani is a case in point. So he's going to the glorifications of the past, he's going into the past, and then one is set in a different world. That's so much so that one forgets the link that it must have with the present. And here, of course, it's a more very individualistic kind of a venture that Prasad enters into, where he talks about, the problems that an individual faces, whether it's of desire or it's of, this kind of ideologies, and what should one go with, whether it is calm and other spheres of life. And he says Shraddha is most important, devotion is most important. So you see this kind of a choices that are available to the individual. Now, these choices again in Prasad are limited to the individual and does not go to the social sphere. So his kind of poetry then, takes a very different turn. And again, when we speak of Sumitranandan Pant, then of course Pant has, he talks about the village life, about common people, but then the view is again subjective and doesn't pan out into a kind of a social, I would still say that he's very close to this kind of socialistic writing or committed writing, but he's just in a brooding subjective space, and he's probably just one step away, away from where Nirala is. So in that sense, all these poets, even Mahadevi Verma, she talks about in her poetry about the relationship with the divine lover. And that kind of relationship she emphasizes too much. So Nirala is trying to build an alternative space. It's not to say that he doesn't talk about nature, the themes of love, nature, and the yearning of the soul. All these are present in Nirala as well. But then he moves, often he moves out of them to talk about other people who have been living and how they have been living. And one of the examples of such a person is, the poem that I wish to actually read out to you today, which is called The Stonebraker. And in this poem, I'll just read out the poem to you, and you might be able to understand what I'm trying to say here. So Nirala says here, the title is The Stonebraker. And who is this Stonebraker? It's a woman that he's actually talking about. It's not a man who's a stonebreaker. It's somebody he sees, on the path, and when he sees this woman on the way, he pens down this poem. So he says, she, a stonebreaker, on the road to Allahabad, I met her. A stonebreaker, not the slightest shadow, the cool of which she might have greeted. Her dark body, withholding youth, eyes lowered, thoughts buried in the stones she breaks. So you see, her thoughts are all buried in the stones that she breaks, and she is doing this hard labor. So he's talking about the grit and the resilience of a woman here, if you note. As I go further, so thoughts buried in the stones she breaks, wielding the unwieldy hammer, she strikes. Before her sprawl the tree-girt mansions, the mounting sun on a hot day. The blaze of the heat, the scorching loo, the earth like cotton seared with a mist of dust overspread. Yet another afternoon saw her, a stonebreaker. Looking up, she saw me, saw the houses, but saw them with unseeing eyes. Saw me through undefeated eyes. I knew then what I had never known before. A moment later, her body trembling, there fell a drop from her sweat-washed forehead. Turning once more to the stones, she said, I, a stone breaker. Now, when we look at this poem, then, what strikes one most is this undefeated attitude or undefeated eyes of the woman. That is very important here, that she knows the work that she's supposed to do, and there's no, it's the blazing heat. In blazing heat she's working. There is not a shade anywhere for her, but she continues to work. She continues to break the stone as if she will find her path no matter what. And in a way it becomes a symbol of the nationalist movement itself, that the country is going to keep striking. The country is going to wield the unwieldy hammer, as said here, and will make its way and finally know that we are stonebreakers and we have to make our path. So there's a kind of determination, there's a kind of undefeated attitude here, and resilience, which is very important. And interestingly, Nirala associates all these values with the woman. So you can see that here, even when he's written, I'll also, read a lyric, a kind of a romantic lyric that he wrote, which was Juhi Ki Kali, an early poem that he wrote. And there you can see his love for nature and other things. But here he's a very different personality. So Nirala, in a way, his life is quite a, is a blend of so many different attitudes, and his change of opinions, his change of attitude as well. Even as he was very much deeply in love with literature, he seldom forgot, the role that it had to play. And this was, I think, it wasn't probably there in his early works, but later he understood, because we have to understand that till the 1920s, the Dvivedi poets were there, and 20s and 30s is the period that the Chayawadi poets are writing. And Nirala's, the greatest works, his tour de force as, Ram Ki Shakti Puja and others, all these are written post 1935. Now, this is the period, post 1935 is also the period of formative years for a different kind of movement which is going to, spread out in the 1940s. And this is the period of Pragativad in Hindi literature, which is called as progressive writing or progressivism. Of course, alongside with progressivism, there is experimentalism, which is also there, and that is Prayogwad. So that is also there. But Nirala then becomes a kind of a precursor of Pragativad, because he becomes that important link between Chayawad and Pragativad, because he is in that transition period, and he's the one who's able to join and blend these two, and he's able to give direction, he's able to open that space for poets who will write progressive poetry, because a lot of his works are based on this. Again, when we speak of Ram ki Shakti Puja, then that is also based on the determination and sheer will. This determination that you see in the woman here is there in the determination of in the figure of Ram. Of course, he is using the myth. Now, very interestingly, he uses the myth but then he makes this myth very our own, because what we are not interested in our past. Then we are interested in the emotion. We are interested in that emotional state that Ram is in that moment when he is in despair. And in despair, then he tries to rise up, and in despair he tries to rise against Ravan, and then performs the puja for Shakti. And and what is Shakti? So you see, the interpretation of the myth is also is an important task that Nirala takes up. So it is this interpretation of the myth that it is Shakti which is what we need in this in our own time. If there is something to borrow from the past, then the past is of course valuable for Nirala, and but then he chooses very carefully what is important for the times, what is historically necessary at a particular time in history. And for him, then, at this particular moment, it is Ram as a human being who is also going through pangs of despair and of suffering, and it is he at this point who's performing this puja, and he's ready to give one eye of his for the sacrifice, because there's one lotus which is missing in the puja, and for the completion of the puja, the lotus must be there, and he thinks of giving one eye to it. So the sacrifice, it might require this movement, this kind of national struggle might extract everything from you, and it would require your soul. But then Nirala suggests that you should be willing to lay your life. You should be willing to give which is most precious to you for the larger struggle of society. So you see, he's able to bring that, he's able to bring that angle and bring myths to the lives of people in a very interesting fashion here. And so I feel that Nirala then, in a way becomes very important as we understand the period of Pragativad, as we understand the progressive poets, because he is able to lay down certain foundations for the movement. Also, the one way in which I think that the progressives don't follow Nirala is that Nirala also, takes in his lyrics or in his poems a lot of Sanskritized words, and his own, when he writes, then it's quite highly Sanskritized kind of, pattern that his poetry takes, and that is something that the progressive poets actually tried to steer clear of. They wanted to write in the language of ordinary people, and they wanted to also communicate to the people the ideas, and for that reason they did not follow the route of using a lot of Sanskrit words. In fact, they tried to make it more simplistic, and so this blend of trying to make it simplistic and trying to stay away from Sanskrit, and yet there is a sprinkle of words here and there. You find that to be the case in Muktibodh, and I will be talking about Muktibodh in the next half of the lecture. But to talk about Nirala here, I'd also like to talk about another interesting and very important poem of his, which is called Saroj Smriti, and it's called Remembering Saroj. I'd read out a portion to also suggest that how Nirala is able to bring in personal symbolisms, bring in the personal, very deeply personal with the objective, and also talk about, Saroj Smriti is about, let me give a background to this poem. His daughter died young when she was just 19 years old, and in 1935, when she's 19 years old, she dies, and in her memory, then Nirala writes this poem. But when Nirala's life actually has been a series of lot of misfortunes, because in 1917 and 1918 his wife also died, and he was left to fend for the family. Not only his own family, his brother and his brother and sister-in-law, they also died. So their children, his own children, they saw suddenly this kind of responsibility came to Nirala, but a sense of loss. He saw from close quarters this sense of loss. So this sense of loss is carried forward when he loses his daughter, and and at that moment he becomes deeply introspective as well. And so Saroj Smriti, Remembering Saroj, this poem is as much about Saroj as it is about Nirala. And so Nirala actually is talking about his own self in this poem while remembering Saroj. And if I'll just read some portions and you'll know the kind of values, the kind of path of life that he chose. So the poem begins in this manner. Scarcely 19, you took one step and crossed the whole of life. My daughter, closed your young eyes to your father and said, farewell to living. My song, you shed this individual self and entered forever freedom beyond the changing. You had lived out your 18 years fulfilled and pure, when your swift feet mounted the ship of death, as though to say, Father, I choose the full light. This isn't dying, but only the lotus brightening a crossing over. So this is the first stanza, and so you see, of course, it is only the lotus brightening. The lotus, Saroj, is the meaning of Saroj is lotus, and so here, it's to attain a greater freedom. So you can see a sense of, that union with the infinite in that sense, and a crossing over that, of bridging these boundaries of life and that kind of union. But then when he talks about, so at this moment there's a kind of transcendental kind of strain here, but when he starts talking about himself, then his focus becomes very, very realistic. He says here, being a poet, I had some understanding, so I might catch the speech of silent lips. So he's very aware here of being a poet. He says that being a poet, I understand the language of silence, and therefore I could understand what you were saying. And he goes on to talk about the daughter. And then he says, daughter, I was a worthless father, did nothing for you. Although I knew some ways of earning, I would always let them slip away, knowing, as I well knew, the wrongs attending the path to wealth. You see, here there's a kind of clarity in Nirala when he says that I knew the path of earning, but I did not take it because I knew the wrongs that were attending this path of success or of wealth. Then he says, I always lost the struggle for success. So that is the key of Nirala. He says, I've always lost the struggle for success. And so, my dear, I couldn't dress you in silk or even give you enough to eat. But I could never snatch the poor man's bread or bear to see him weep. I always saw reflected in my tears only my own face and my own heart. So you see, this is Nirala, who's trying to define his way of life and also define his choice of a path in life that he has taken. And this comes very close to Muktibodh, who will also take the same path in life, where he'll say that I choose not to take the path of success. So with this, I will close the first half of the lecture and come back to speak about Muktibodh.
Viewers, we have had a discussion about Nirala's role in Hindi poetry and in the national movement, particularly from the point of view of culture. And the next part of the lecture, which begins in a short while, will be focusing upon Muktibodh. Till then, please wait. So welcome friends, we have had a view of Nirala and his role in poetry, and the way he shaped a particular trend in the early part of the 20th century and went on to inspire a whole generation of writers. So now we shift to Muktibodh, and I request Dr. Bajaj once again to talk about Muktibodh.
Thank you, Dr. Prakash. Welcome back, viewers. So we were discussing Nirala in the previous half of the lecture, and I actually spoke to you about how Nirala took that path of failure. And he says that the wealth that I choose not to follow the path of wealth because I know the wrongs that accompany it, and I could not snatch a poor man's bread. Now that is the idea of success that he's trying to project here. That success inevitably involves snatching the bread of the poor. So, he knows that this is not the path that he is going to take, and to lead a kind of an honest life and, the life of an honest and, a life of integrity, it is important that he follow his own path, and this path would seldom bring, any kind of success. And so, he did not, in fact, this is the kind of strain that we see pronounced in progressive writing of the 1940s, and this is the period, and particularly in the case of Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh, that this half of the lecture would focus on. Now, when we speak of Gajanan Madhav Muktibodh, then Muktibodh also says in one of his poems, shares a similar idea, that where he says, I wear the dirt and dust of failure because success is always available, on this kind of the path of, success is always there, comes with cheat and money. So there is cheat and money which is involved with success, and he says, I wear the dirt and dust of failure because I can never take that path of cheat and of dishonesty. So this is that path that, this kind of honesty of self is what, it joins or links Nirala with Muktibodh. Now, if we come to, when we talk about Muktibodh, then, we have to understand again a very different kind of ethos that he is following. So, Muktibodh is born in 1917, and he was born in the Shirpur district in Gwalior. And he was born to, his father was a police officer, so, he had a very transferable job. So, he went from one place to another, finished his schooling, and started taking up a job in Barnagar school. And so, Muktibodh, again, as early in his teen years, he was aware of, the different dimensions of politics. He was aware of, he had involved himself in different groups and political and even literary groups. And he in fact started the central, in central India, he started the Progressive Writers group. And, so he was again on the path of progressivism, and he tried to reinforce the ideas of progressivism. But then, he had a different path. He wasn't following the propagandist or the rigid kind of literature that was being written otherwise as well. And he tried to keep a more open, democratic space because he felt that, freedom of expression was very important in literature. And this is the link that we find with Nirala as well, that both of them tried to chart their own territory without being bothered about fitting into certain groups or certain political, ideological groups in society. And because they followed their own path, they were also able to explore and invent a different kind of poetry. So if Nirala, brings in a kind of personal symbolism and talks about these symbols which have a very personal strain, then Muktibodh also makes use of these symbols, but then he talks about the dark, the hidden areas of life. He doesn't take the symbols of beauty. And he doesn't believe in that kind of aestheticism, of where everywhere the poet takes it upon himself to talk about beautiful objects. But he moves into a different kind of symbolism, and his symbolism include, objects such as the caves or the ruins or the landscapes and the thistle. These are the things, the thistle on the wayside. These are the symbols and the objects of focus in Muktibodh, not the flower or the beautiful weather, or the clouds, the general images that poets take. stage. And again, this with this I come to the first point that I raised in the first half of the lecture as to the role of poetry. The poets are also trying to redefine themselves, and poetry is redefining itself. Poetry doesn't choose anymore to make its concerns the clouds and the leaves and the flowers and the beauty of nature or the beauty of life. Rather, it wants to talk about the grim reality. It wants to talk about people, their suffering, and their loss. All this poetry wants to register, and so there has been a clear shift in poetry as well. Poetry is not then limited to those kind of aesthetic qualities, and it has become experiential on its way. But it's not limited also to experience. In Muktibodh particularly, experience is guided by thought. And feeling is always guided by thought. And so thought for him also is incomplete, and in that sense, thought might be seen as, thought would become in that sense barren without that kind of quality of emotion or that kind of, the emotional experience. So in that sense, when Muktibodh uses the word, the term Jnanatmak Samvedna and Samvedatmak Jnana, then he's actually referring to a combination of the cognitive principle and the sensitive principle. So sensitivity and feeling and emotion need to combine with thinking and also ideas. When ideas and feelings combine, that's where a different kind of poetry is comes to the fore, gets generated, and where fantasy is not limited to one's figment of imagination, but fantasy that is rooted in reality. Now, fantasy for Muktibodh also is a very different concept. He doesn't see it as a kind of just imaginative space. In fact, he says it is that space where different experiences of people come together. This he elaborates in his, essays more particularly. He talks about the cultural process, and he talks about poetry's, when he talks about the form and content of poetry. It is in these essays that he is actually trying to outline these principles of, a creative process. And also it is there in his, in the third moment of creativity, which he calls the Tisra Kshan. Now, in these, he's trying to build a different concept of fantasy and different concept of poetry itself, when he says that a person's experiences are not limited to that person, and that one person's experiences combine with the experiences of other people around him or her. And then he says that this is also not limited to one particular time. Experiences which have been important in history also, the memory of that experience gets combined with the present experience, and all this together, all these experiences of the past, of other people's experiences, of people living in this particular moment, all of them combine to give something. And what comes out, and the poet then tries to build a kind of relation and gives it a pattern, a kind of a discipline to all these different emotions, and creates something in poetry which then becomes valid for the present time. And this is very important. And therefore he also defines the role of a poet at a particular given time. So when Muktibodh defines the role of the poet, I'd actually like to talk about Muktibodh's statement that he gives. Very, very sharply he presents his statement, and I'd like to read this out. And this is again the period that is written in this is the 1940s, that he's trying to understand the situation. And this is and it becomes a comment on the times, which is 1940s and 50s as well. So he says, the poet at the present times live in an uncommon and extraordinary age. This is an age when the question of human civilization has become significant. Society is very seriously ridden with inequality. One is witness to an all-round moral decline. Exploitation and oppression have reached an all-time high. Swindling, opportunism, and corruption are the order of the day. Messiahs of yesterday have turned oppressors. Spiritualists have entirely lost touch with the masses. Most of the thinkers and analysts stand distanced from the issues of life. They'll confine themselves to the study of literary aesthetic aspects and would not step beyond. Scenes of bitterness, pain, injustice, and suffering abound. The gap between the oppressing and the oppressed in society has widened more than before. The phenomena is fearsome, to the extent that even within the middle classes, some groups have little link with others and are in fact adding through actions to the existing inequality. We discern today a yawning gap between the ordinary school teachers and university professors, the poor people and the khadi-clad leaders, the office clerks and high officials, not to speak of the distance between poor peasants and workers on the one side and industrialists, landlords on the other. Human relations are under tremendous strain and have become tangled. Exploiters, oppressors, and their associates rule the roost. In new poetry too, one can see the emergence of two opposing groups. One is vitally linked with the upper class and the other has its roots in poverty. Their class tendencies are reflected not only in their poetry but also in their thought and attitude. Unquote. So, you see this kind of a poet's statement coming from Muktibodh, who's trying to understand the trend of new poetry that surfaces in the 1950s particularly, where, the independence has been won, but the values and the vision of independence has become totally distorted, and whatever was aspired for has been totally defeated. And so, in this phase, writers are coming to terms with this new reality of, trying to come to terms with this kind of inequality which existed even before partition, and they're trying to now understand what is the way out. So, with reference to this particular statement by Muktibodh, I'd request Dr. Anand Prakash to make some observations on this particular aspect of Indian scenario.
No, actually, the two things that you said, one about Nirala and the other about Muktibodh, there appears to be a gap between them, but then that gap, as you have pointed out, can be filled up with certain imagination. For instance, Nirala talks about independence, Nirala talks about society, Nirala talks about the use of myth in his own manner, and he's, as you said, carving a new self, which means that he's focusing upon individualism in the early 20th century. And then you have in the 1930s and 40s the emergence of Muktibodh, who is extending the scope of what Nirala did still further, and brings society quite close to the concerns of the poet. This is the argument that you have made, and I think it's an argument that should be gone into with seriousness. That the national movement in the early decades of the 20th century finally gets its flesh and blood, gets its passion, and now would be addressing questions of society and exploitation. The words that you used for Muktibodh's distinctive, poetry, which informs them, his poetry, are inequality, moral decline, exploitation, and limiting oneself to aesthetic. These are the issues you say, and you quoted Muktibodh that way quite succinctly. So I believe that the gap is filled up between the two poets by the national movement which is surrounding both of them, and things are coming to a head because British imperialism is becoming more and more intolerant, and it's losing its sheen also in the context of a colony. And these two poets are gaining in awareness, and finally they become expressions of some kind of a discontent. So this is the point you have made, and I think it's a point worth considering, and it is this, in my opinion, that makes these two poets the major voices of 20th century Hindi poetry.
Indian poetry, and especially in Hindi literature, that's the case. And in this context, I'd like to also read a poem by Muktibodh where he's talking about those who have have sided with the rich, the literary aesthetes that he talks about, and these aesthetes according to him have sided with the rich and have rejected or have abandoned the concerns of the poor. And when Muktibodh is trying to still talk about the concerns of the deprived section of society, the view that is taken by the intellectuals in the field, who have become his enemies, and this is what he says about them, and he talks about his own self. The poem is called Kehne do unhe jo kehte hain, let them say what they will. And he goes on, and I quote from the poem, I feel scared of becoming an owl, jackal or ghost, taking refuge in the shade of success, attractive as the moon. Now compare this with what Nirala also talked about in Saroj Smriti when he talked about success, and he says, I don't wish to have that success because that is, that means snatching poor people's bread. And here again the same idea, a similar idea is being exposited, where he says that so I feel scared of becoming an owl, jackal or ghost, taking refuge in the shade of success, attractive as the moon. They are afraid too. The question haunts them, why should he remain a human when all of us have turned into ghosts, jackals and owls? Why should his annoyed, tortured soul thrive? Once we are dead and turned ghosts, and his soul too is a phantom, together shall we dance on the banks of dried up, rocky waterfall, excited in the light of the moon success.
In these powerful lines, of this poem, Muktibodh is talking about the demerits of success. So how is it that a kind of reality is being symbolized through the concept of success? What does he exactly say about success then?
You see, what he means to talk about, as I understand through the poetry of Muktibodh, is that he's talking, most of his poetry is about the middle class. And when he's talking about the middle class, then he's actually talking about the role that the middle class intellectual plays in the scenario in the 1940s and 50s particularly. And when he talks about this group, then he says that even after partition, even after gaining independence, these groups have now been, when he says the messiahs of yesterdays have become oppressors, then he's trying to say that those people who fought for freedom earlier in the pre-independence period have now turned their back to the grieving masses, and have now turned towards success, have turned towards taking awards and taking important places in government offices, and have are now furthering the cause of the rich. So that is something that he's constantly underlying, that, even among intellectuals, the intellectuals now have also stopped talking about even making in poetry the concerns of the people. They've stopped even talking about the people's concerns, what they talk about. And, here I might be able to talk about, to some extent, they've turned to a kind of modernism of the self, where the focus becomes the self of the poet. And, this is very clearly, and this is the reason why Muktibodh had very sharp kind of exchanges with Agyay, and who in the 1950s then became the voice of modernism in Hindi literature. And Agyay in his poetry, if we see Asadhya Veena, or when he talks about knowing the secrets of the cosmos, then you find that his concerns are either too broad, in the sense where he is going to universalisms and the cosmos. He says, अब मुझे नक्षत्र के रहस्य भी पता चल गए हैं, अब मैं सब कुछ जानता हूँ. So this sense that I know everything now, and that there is a kind of complacency that sets in that kind of literature, the modernist kind of literature, which Muktibodh tries to steer clear of. And it is these writers who are also being published, it is these writers who are also getting fame and acknowledgements and awards, and this is success. This is what I mean by success.
What is Muktibodh's view of the role of the middle class in the post-independence India, which is different from that of Agyay? Agyay's view is different.
Yes, Agyay no more talks about the middle class as a kind of a collective unity. He in fact looks at himself as a very individualized persona, and he says that I alienation and loneliness is what defines me, and my solitude in fact nourishes my artistic work. So that is something very sacred for Agyay. But when we come to Muktibodh, then that loneliness and solitude, when Muktibodh talks about them, then he knows that this outside outside circumstance is responsible for it, and that must be changed, and that must be, the situation must change in itself.
What is nourishing? What is nourishing in artistic expression?
Nourishing in the sense that solitude gives, a kind of, becomes a fodder on which the writer can feed further, and, gives him further thoughts about the ideas of the universe, his own self, vis-a-vis, vis-a-vis life. I wouldn't use the word society, because I guess seldom sees himself in relation to society, and he in fact sees himself in relation to the infinite, the cosmic and the universal, or comes back to his own self. So his idea of life is that way very different from Muktibodh, and for Muktibodh the personal has to go towards the social. He doesn't see himself as an independent persona who can exist without people, who can exist without a role in society.
So it's a conflict between pain on one side and success on the other, happiness on the other. Somebody is happy when exploitation is increasing, and somebody else is feeling pain.
No, pain is there in the modernist poets as well, and but they are pained because, and there is a sense of helplessness, and there is a kind of acceptance, in new poetry as well. When new poetry tries to find its own path in the 1950s, then or experimentalism of the 1940s, particularly post 1943, when Tar Saptak is out. After that, poets are trying to find a new way of expressing themselves, because they find life to be too varied, and they are known for their experimentation and novelty. But as we move to 1950s, we find that either the poets have turned helpless, or they have become more complacent with the system at hand, and turning towards cynicism. So cynicism is setting in the Indian context in the 1950s, and this is what becomes the concern of Muktibodh's poetry. And I think Muktibodh among his contemporaries perhaps was one of the few who actually tried to take up arms against cynicism as well. He found his friends also falling prey to cynicism, and then he goes on to talk about what is important for people like him, because in the poem again, Kehne Do Unhe Jo Kehte Hain, he says, "You and I have just one thing in sight, the measure of honor, the javelin of knowledge, the shovel of courage, the tagari of the heart." So these are the ideals that he still sticks to, and he feels this is what will show us the way, the scuttle to make ever new mansions of the soul of the human being. So you see, these are the things that he still holds dear. But again, I think that the times are turning so bleak and dark that Muktibodh had to write, or was necessitated to write this kind of poem, which he's very well known for, Andhere Mein. And this is written in the 1950s, particularly in the later around 1958 or so, when he's writing this poem. Then it's a long poem where expression is not limited to, again, it's not a short poem. Towards the end of his life, Muktibodh died in 1964. So towards the end of his life, he was writing very long poems. And again, if we see the role of poetry, you will note that poetry becomes very narrative oriented in this particular period. So because there is so much to say, because the writer is using poetry as a medium to talk about ideological conflicts, to talk about the political sphere, to talk about the way society or the state functions. So he required a long space, and then poetry gave that this kind of long narrative poetry or epic poetry of this sense becomes that kind of is that space that the writer uses to voice his concerns.
For Muktibodh, what is the meaning of Andhera? We're using Andhera in a central manner in his major poem.
So Andhera, of course, as we understand the word Andhera, at one level it appears to be darkness and has negative connotations. But again, this is exactly what this is the scenario of the 1940s, which is all dark, and for some it is a negative space. But for Muktibodh, Andhera also has the potential of bringing in light, because he also believes that darkness darkness carries a lot of hidden areas which are still unexplored, carries truths which have not come to light. So his role as a poet, his work as a poet, is to bring these truths into the open. And in fact, in one of in Andhere Mein, when he talks about the truth, then he says that they catch me by the collar and almost strangle me. They deliver a deadly blow, and I feel the skin has come off my cheek. I hear a horrible ringing in my ears. I see blue sparks and red butterflies. So this person, because he has understood the truth and is trying to bring out the truth, is being hit by the adversaries. And this is what he says that then he goes on to say that I am made to sit on the broken stool. My skull is being battered by huge hammers. Raining blows. They've broken open my head. They are searching it now, because you see, that is the kind of danger that the writer, or the precarious situation that the writer finds himself in, because he's trying to express the truth. Because here again, if I could just talk about it. He talks about the procession he talks about the procession in Andhere Mein that he sees at night. And here he says, fearsome dead souls of the city march in the airy procession. At night, while during the day they conspire in various offices and homes and centers. I've seen through them, I've caught them with their pants down, I will be punished. So this is what I mean to say, that it is only at night, it is only in the dark that all these centers of power, they come together, and they actually are seen in their actual truth. So for Muktibodh, the darkness carries certain pointers to truth, and certain pointers to optimism as well. Truth inevitably takes him towards optimism, that there is hope to be found by poets, and the times are dark, in the dark times. So in that sense, I feel that Muktibodh also shows this kind of hope and optimism, despite showing these grey areas or the dark areas of life. And this is what then defines the poetry of 1950s as well. And with this, I'd like to close today's lecture on Hindi poetry, which spans the period from the early 20th century to the post-independence period. Thank you, viewers.
Thanks, Dr. Bajaj, for this lecture on Hindi poetry in the 20th century, with particular reference to Nirala and Muktibodh, and the two pillars of Hindi poetry in the 20th century. They represent the use of imagination and the use of fantasy, and they always focus upon the reality of Indian society, its pains, its miseries, its tribulations, and these people finally start representing that anguish, that helplessness, that sense of exploitation that people have to bear all the time. So this poetry is realistic in a different sense. At the same time, this poetry is not given to any helplessness as an accepted fact, but as something which is to be poetically sorted out. So I believe the points made by you, Dr. Bajaj, are going to further enrich the understanding of these two poets, plus the trend that they represent in the 20th century. So with this, we come to the end of the lecture, and we will have other lectures in the series to follow. Thanks.